Well, that happened fast. So Syrian opposition forces earlier today just captured Hama, the fifth largest city in Syria, just a couple days after they surprisingly took Aleppo. Look, when Aleppo fell, there were a lot of people saying, I guess the opposition forces were better equipped and better organized than people gave them credit for. Maybe the Syrian regime forces weren't all they were cracked up to be. But then Aleppo fell very quickly, to a lot of people's surprise, and they haven't stopped. In fact, there's a lot of arguments that we're going to get into today that HTS actually has a lot of momentum, and there's no indications they're going to be stopping anytime soon. I mean, it was barely 24 hours ago, rumors started to emerge that Hama might be in the sights of the Syrian opposition forces, and wake up this morning, just like that, Hama has fallen. Now, in today's video, there's a couple things we're going to get into. First, why the momentum is on the side of HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, led by a man named Jolani. We're going to get into some of his details and why that organization is believed by some to be moderating its stance, but fingers crossed there. We're going to look at some of the captured equipment by HTS during the course of these operations, as well as Assad forces giving up and his allies not stepping in to back up his regime. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with some key items to keep an eye on here in the next few days and weeks. Now, starting out, I'm going to move over to a map update here. This is Live UA Map. It's a publicly available resource, and I thought it could be beneficial to start the video out here to give you an idea of some of the areas we're talking about during the course of this ongoing war. So again, a couple of different looks here. We've got all of Syria, Damascus down here, the capital where Assad is located in the southwestern portion of the country. As a bit of an overview, the red here is Syrian-controlled territory, so Assad regime forces or Assad's allies, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, things like that. The green down here in the bottom right, this is actually the Antaf garrison, right in this location here. That's where it's one of the larger U.S. Bases in the region. Up here in the yellow, the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and the U.S. does have a couple bases here along the Euphrates. We're going to talk about those a little bit later in today's video. Green is the HTS area, and we'll see just how much that actually changed here in recent days. And then these gray circles are, an Islamic State presence of sorts. Notably, we actually haven't seen a lot from Islamic State in the last week or so. There's a couple of different ways to look at that. Islamic State does still very much exist in Syria. They've been significantly degraded by the United States, SDF, Russia, and others throughout Syria over the years. But we haven't seen much of anything. So one argument is that they're just waiting to see if there's a power vacuum they can fill. The other argument is they don't actually have the capability to take advantage of any of this ongoing chaos. Now, shifting over here to northwestern Syria, where the majority of the fighting has happened in the last week, to give you an idea of how much territory HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, has taken, look at this. So this green again here, this darker green is the area HTS now controls. This little bit here in Idlib is what HTS controlled prior to the start of their offensive last week. So this little section here, HTS, all of this that is light green right now was red just about a week ago. So at the time when this offensive kicked off, people said, oh my God, they're actually moving on Aleppo. They're heading in that direction. Could they possibly take what is arguably one of, if not the largest city by population in all of Syria? There's been a lot of internal displacement over the years. That's hard to measure. But they quickly not only moved to, but through and captured all of Aleppo. Zoom out a little bit here to give you an idea of the scale of the territory that they have since taken, which should be taken with a grain of salt, right? And we saw this with the ongoing war in Ukraine, where just because military forces move through an area does not automatically mean that they fully control that territory. It's a little bit different here, though. It's not so much about having a military presence throughout that entire territory, and much more about having the support of anybody who is inside of that area. Now, after taking Aleppo, the HTS forces, led by HTS, I should say, there are a bunch of different aligned factions, to include some pretty extremist ones, all things considered, that have fought alongside them, moving south down here towards Hama. And it was yesterday afternoon we started to get some information that Hama might be in trouble. There's an indication that that opposition forces were moving in on this location. And before long, we started to see a couple different entrance and exit routes taken over by HTS, which is a problem for a lot of people. And then wake up this morning, a couple hours later, and Hama has fallen. In fact, there was an announcement put out by the Assad regime saying that they chose to not fight for Hama because they wanted to spare the civilians of having to go through an urban combat situation, which is, I'd be skeptical of that claim. First off, it looked like a lot of opposition forces were fleeing at baseline, but also throughout this entire war, Assad has not really been hesitant to bomb civilian centers, start to finish, and conduct significant urban operations that have razed entire cities to the ground. The idea that all of a sudden right now he's saying, wait a minute, let's see what we can do to save the civilians in Hama is a bit rich, all things considered. Now, before going back to some videos of the recent operations, I did want to show some other locations on the map here. There's a couple areas in the western portion of Syria on the coast of the Mediterranean worth calling out. The first is right down in here, Tartus. This is the location of the Russian naval base. So to give you an idea, zoomed out a little bit here, it was not anywhere near some of these opposition forces, but in recent days, you can see how quickly they've moved down, and all of a sudden, they're not too far away from the Russian naval base, the only Russian naval base in the Mediterranean, and arguably the only reason that Russia is in Syria at all, to maintain this location. But it's not just Tartus. Just north of there, in Latakia, in this location here, you have a pretty significant Russian airfield. This is where a lot of the Russian airstrikes, specifically in Idlib province, have been taking place, or have been emanating from. So as Syrian opposition forces continue to move south, and just in the last few days, they've been dropping flyers on Homs, saying they're coming there next, and telling the Assad forces there, hey, it's okay to surrender, and more on that in a second. We're heading in your direction. If they get down here, it's entirely possible that the Russian forces in Latakia and Tartus will be cut off from the rest of Syrian territory. It's not crazy that in the next few days here, we might see some significant moves by Russia as it relates to Syria. I will link that map in the description below if you want to check that out. Again, live UA map, publicly available resource. Now, looking into a couple indications as to why the HTS-led rebel or opposition forces at this point, jihadis, I should say, right? In fact, there was a good podcast that'll link in the description below yesterday, put out by Generation Jihad, where the title of it was something along the lines of, in Syria, sometimes the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy. And these are guys who have been knee-deep in understanding the Middle East for 20-plus years at this point, and some really good perspective on kind of exactly who HTS is and the type of organization they might end up being once they take more control inside of Syria. So when looking at a couple of the indications as to why they're really not stopping and may not stop anytime soon, there's a couple key aspects here. First, we are seeing Assad's forces flee, a lot of them running away, a lot of them being killed. We're seeing a lot of bodies, a lot of them being captured and apparently being treated okay. And I just mentioned a minute ago, there have been indications that flyers and leaflets, pamphlets are being dropped over, Syrian regime-controlled areas saying, hey, Assad forces, give up. It's okay. We're not going to behead you or torture you like we saw from some Islamic State factions and other extremist organizations in the Syrian civil war historically. So if that's the case, and you're some of these Assad forces, you recognize that this is a situation where you don't have to fight to the death, especially if you see this organization moving relatively rapidly. Again, take it back to where Islamic State moving across portions of eastern Syria, western Iraq 10 or so years ago, that group was just straight executing people they didn't like. So you fought to the death or you got out of Dodge. Right now, it looks like HTS is providing alternative options to the Assad regime forces, telling them you can surrender and you, at the very least, won't be tortured and killed. And I should note there have been few videos and pictures coming out suggesting that there have been executions at various points throughout this war, which is unfortunately kind of expected in this conflict. Never a good thing, never should be normalized. We have seen it a lot here, but nowhere near the degree that we've seen in past offensives. So HTS is making a big push right now to say, we are humane, we're going to treat everyone equally, and they've put out messages to Kurds, Christians, and other ethnic minorities saying we are going to create a coalition inside of Syria after this is all done, and Jolani has actually urged his forces to not carry out any sort of vengeance killings when they move into new areas. So one of the things to keep in mind is if Assad's forces see that it might actually be in their benefit to give up, we might see more of that. And these guys might decide to not stand and fight. And this is something that we saw to a degree in Afghanistan as the Taliban began to take over. These are people that live in the country, and they recognize that after this fighting is done, whatever shape it takes, they're still going to be living there. So you're going to see a lot of people that maybe aren't extreme in the Assad camp. They just happen to be in this location